differentiating reality and knowledge of reality.
One of the biggest challenges in defining consciousness is our inability to move beyond abstractions. Consider a computer with a program designed to identify color. If you put a strawberry in front of a camera attached to that computer, a computer can quickly label that strawberry as red. But that identification comes as a result of a digital abstraction, not any physical experience on the part of the computer. The light reflected from the strawberry triggers something physical like plus 5 volts on a line in the computer. That plus 5 volts is meaningless unless the programmer assigns a name to it with the dictionary function. The function could just as easily be programmed to label the plus 5 volts as green instead of red, or blue, or really any other word. For example, in an old punch card computer, a programmer could decide that a certain pattern of holes on a card represents the color red. The next day, they could decide that a different pattern of holes on the card represents the color red. The pattern of holes on a card are intrinsic to that card. So while the label shifts on the whim of the programmer, the intrinsic properties of each card remain unchanged. So when we accept the computer's label of red for a strawberry, we actually talking about two different things. One is the abstract word red, and the other is the physical plus 5 volts, which the computer's dictionary says red is a label for. But whether it's plus 5 volts or a punch card, the substrate is a real physical thing that functions unchanged regardless of how it's labeled. But the abstractions we apply to them can and do change. While they can apply any abstract label to any intrinsic quality they choose, even if they are different, the reality of that redness in their direct experience doesn't change when the abstract label does. It is an intrinsic irreducible quality that requires no interpretation or definition, and like the punch cards, it is something real. Identifying intrinsic qualities of specific things is the only way to overcome qualia blindness. Let's try to reduce this to something as simple as a single pixel we perceive on a strawberry. That single flashing pixel is one of the many pixels whose intrinsic properties we can't perceive. The light from the pixel moves down the chain of perception, encountering several different substrates along the way, each with different intrinsic properties. Each different representation requires a different dictionary or transducing mechanism to the next link in the chain to enable the abstract red meaning to be preserved across all the different substrates. This is what enables us to simply think of all of them as if they represented red. Any interruption or alteration by an interpretation mechanism anywhere along the chain will change the final result. It is entirely possible that any of the interpretation mechanisms between any link in the chain is engineered differently so the information produces a different quality than the one being experienced in another brain. But since we abstractly label the results in both brains with the word red, we have no way of knowing whether that same word is the label for the same qualitative experience in both brains. It could well be that your redness is like my greenness. This demonstrates the limits of the abstractions we use to label individual intrinsic properties, like those of the strawberry or anything else we perceive from afar. Dennett points out qualia are personal, private, and ineffable. This ineffability is the essence of the explanatory gap. This gap between the target of perception and our knowledge of such is a key part of this ineffability. To bridge this gap, we need to know two things. The first is to know the final results of perception, or our subjective awareness of the strawberry. That part is subjectively easy. We all know everything there is to know about our qualia, because it is something we apprehend directly. Second, we need to know everything about someone else's qualia too. That part only seems easy because when we encounter redness subjectively, we say that is red, and we assume that is also an objective description. To bridge these gaps, we need to move beyond the abstraction and know what the substrate is. We can't just use the label we use for our private punch cards. We have to see the intrinsic properties of the other person's punch cards. We intrinsically define red to be our redness. What we don't know is if someone else defines red to be our greenness. We mistakenly rely on our own perception to tell us about what someone else directly apprehends, and we naively assume that they must always be the same thing. An important part of all this is that there are two different ways for us to gain physical knowledge. There is perception and direct apprehension. Perception is abstract and done from afar, where qualia are directly apprehended. Abstract things are substrate-independent. Qualia are substrate-dependent. Abstract labels and descriptions provide no qualitative definition, so a dictionary to intrinsic properties is required. So, if any of the different dictionaries between in a link and a chain changes or doesn't work correctly, the conscious knowledge it seems to be changes. There is no interpretation of a quality. The quality of our conscious knowledge is just a fact. It might be a physical fact, or spiritual fact, or functional fact depending on our preferred yet to falsified theory. But in all cases, the quality of our knowledge remains a fact about reality. Even the qualities of mistaken seemings are a fact. If it only seems like we have a redness quality, what is it that has the seeming redness quality, mistaken or not? So this qualitative knowledge cannot be mistaken. We tend to talk about consciousness being instantiated the way an abstract word like red can be instantiated in a computer. Many think of everything in the brain as being nothing but interpretations of interpretations. Again, what you find in computers. Even the terminology of today tends to explicitly separate consciousness in general and qualia in particular from physical reality. Some of the terminology includes neural correlate of, interpretation of, cause of, arises from, elicits, supervenes on, intervenes on. This project is interested in redness itself, not just its neural correlates. Even if redness is in some spiritual realm, we want to objectively pierce into the possible veil between the physical and the spiritual. We want to objectively get into and demonstrate the phenomenal colors we know absolutely exist, no matter where we may find them. If consciousness is functional, as the currently leading popular consensus predicts, in that case we would be interested in whatever abstract function results in a redness experience. But even in the functional case, we would be more interested in the fact that redness arises from whatever function it does happen to arise from. We want to know what it is that has that redness quality, whether it be material, spiritual, functional, or anything else. We should remain open to all possibilities till we, in a non-qualia blind way, directly demonstrate to all what redness is. Descartes knew he could not doubt his existence, or at least he knew he could not doubt his knowledge of his existence. He realized his knowledge could be in a brain in a vat, inspiring the Wachowski's Matrix movie. But you cannot doubt the reality of the redness quality of your knowledge of that red dress. It is a theoretical possibility that the screen which seems to be in front of you isn't really there. There could really be just some matrix feeding abstract data to your brain, identical to the way your perception seems to make it appear to be. That redness, your knowledge of the girl's dress is composed of, would only be a seeming in this matrix case. But even so, that redness seeming must still necessarily be something. Unlike abstract objective knowledge, which could be a lie, subjective redness cannot be a lie. Whatever substrate it is that has that redness quality, whether that redness substrate be material, spiritual, functional, and so on, that is the focus of the Consciousness Consensus Project. In the introduction, we indicated we wanted to pinpoint the location of your qualia. Your qualia aren't out there, and they also aren't in the matrix. They are in the brain, in all those vats in physical reality. Whether your knowledge is in your skull or in a vat, or in some spiritual world, all of those possibilities are falsifiable and should be objectively observable. Once we are no longer qualia blind and can connect the subjective with the objective, we should even be able to falsify, or maybe verify, skeptical theories like solipsism. Solipsism is the theory that predicts there is only your mind and nothing out there. Not being qualia blind should enable us to falsify that theory. After all, our left hemisphere knows infallibly it isn't the only brain hemisphere in existence that is made up of lots of stuff with diverse phenomenal qualities. Two brains being connected, like our two hemispheres are connected via a bundle of neurons called the corpus callosum, was portrayed in the movie Avatar. If we had a computationally bound connection between brains, we could directly experience all of the experience, not just half. When we hug a loved one, a binding connection to the outside world would falsify the possibility that your loved one only exists in your mind. If, when we attempt to make such a neural ponytail, it fails to enable you to directly apprehend anyone out there, that would verify to you that solipsism was a fact and that we are just figments of your imagination. We will get into more detail about what this would all be like in future chapters. Spoiler alert, it won't be like knowledge of your spirit traveling down knowledge of tubes as portrayed in all the movies in a way that clearly fails to distinguish between reality and knowledge of reality. Once we experimentally connect the subjective with the objective, we will soon be able to experimentally and objectively demonstrate, at least to you, which theory is the one. When our teacher told us what intrinsic quality red is a label for, in reality she was telling us red is a label for the intrinsic qualities of our own perceptual experience of the strawberry, from the object, through all the processes involved that culminate in awareness and the association of the label of social convention. In reality, she was telling us red is a label for the intrinsic qualities of our own knowledge of the strawberry. Some people argue that there are no pictures with pixels in the brain. But it is a fact that if we have a single changing pixel in our conscious awareness, that changing pixel is changing from one quality to another. The same must be true for each and every pixel for which we are consciously aware. So just like each pixel must be represented in some way in every link of the chain of perception, there must be something that is responsible for each pixel for conscious knowledge, which can change between different qualia. It is a necessary truth that if we know something like the color of a pixel in a strawberry, that colored knowledge must be something. This is true whether that is physical, spiritual, functional, or whatever. And since qualia are something we directly apprehend, we know without error precisely what our redness qualia is like and how it is qualitatively different from our greenness qualia. In order to distinguish between different intrinsic properties involved in the perception of red things, we need different labels for different intrinsic properties. The terms red and redness are traditionally defined to be more or less synonyms. They are both abstract words, each of which represents all things red. But for the purposes of this video, we redefine them to be labels for different intrinsic properties or qualities. Red, a label for anything with an intrinsic property in that it reflects or emits red light. Redness, a label for the intrinsic quality of our knowledge of red things. Having multiple different labels like this is required for a language or theory to not be qualia blind. Reporting scientific results with abstract language that does things like use one abstract word for all things red is blind to specific intrinsic qualities or qualia. With one word, it is impossible to report on any different changes that may be in any of the specific intrinsic qualities. That is why this kind of abstract terminology that uses one word for all things red is qualia blind. If we use multiple intrinsic defined terms, we can then bridge the explanatory gap. An example effing of the ineffable statement being, my redness is like your greenness, both of which we call red. This is a pile of glutamate, which is a neurotransmitter. It is a theoretical possibility that it could have both white and redness intrinsic properties. Perception from afar provides no qualitative meaning without an intrinsic definition. Thinking that white and whiteness are synonyms could lead one to think a pile of glutamate like that has a whiteness intrinsic quality. However, that would be a qualitative misinterpretation of the sensed abstract data we receive from afar. Even though we can objectively observe colorless qualities, to know the meaning of the sensed abstract data, we must interpret it correctly. We need to qualitatively interpret our abstract knowledge of glutamate by directly apprehending glutamate. If it can be demonstrated to us that white glutamate can be directly apprehended as redness, we should probably assume it is always redness, whether we are directly apprehending its qualities in our brain, or if it is sitting in a pile on the table like that, outside of our brain, if we are utilizing Occam's razor. The same way we assume red paint is still red even when it is in an opaque tube reflecting no light, such that nobody is able to see it. Panpsychists predict everything in nature is conscious, or has some proto-level of consciousness. If that is so, the question then becomes, what are the qualities of those proto-parts of consciousness?
We could use your support. There's a petition topic on canonizing titled, What Are Color Qualities? There's a link to the Demonstrate Subjective Qualities consensus camp in the description below. It would help if you would sign that consensus camp.